Volkes, gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin.
My youngest son asked me to go and look at some of the speeches that Hitler had made. And what it is they've used an AI to reconstruct the video. AI has reconstructed the speeches. So I'm just going to put a little bit of Hitler out. He does seem to have an enemy, the Jewish people, or the Jews. But a lot of what he says, when you listen to it, and this is probably why people wanted to you to hear the speeches, because we're only used to a man standing there screaming and rah rah and using his hands. Anyway, watch these little videos and tell me how much today has changed from what he's talking about. They've always made it that he's a madman and an evil man, but the speeches are very constructed. Anyway, we're going to just listen to a bit. Thank you to the creators for making it. Hope they don't mind me using a little bit of the videos. Yeah, tell me what your thoughts are.
4 years of National Socialism, January 30th, 1937. Men of the German Reichstag. Today, the Reichstag convenes on an important day for the German people. 4 years have passed since the moment that marked the greatest internal transformation and reorganization that Germany has ever experienced. I asked the German people to give me 4 years as trial period. What could be more logical than to use this occasion to enumerate in detail all the successes and progress that these 4 years have brought to the German people? Of course, it will not be possible to mention in such a short rally all the remarkable results of what might be the most astounding epoch in the life of our people. This is rather the task of the press and propaganda. In addition, an exhibition will take place this year in the capital of the Reich, Berlin, in which a more comprehensive and in-depth picture will be presented of what has been created, achieved, and begun than I could possibly do in a 2-hour speech. I will therefore use today's historic meeting of the German Reichstag to look back on the past 4 years and point out some of the general insights, experiences, and conclusions that are important to understand, not only for us, but also for posterity. I would also like to take a position on the most important problems and tasks that face us. And finally, I would also like to outline in the briefest possible terms the projects that I have in mind, some for the near future and some for the more distant future. Who can doubt that in these 4 years that lie behind us, a revolution of the greatest magnitude has indeed swept over Germany? Who can compare this Germany of today with what existed on January 30th, 4 years ago, when I took the oath from the venerable President of the Reich? This National Socialist Revolution was first and foremost a revolution in the conduct of revolutions. By this I mean the following. For thousands of years, not only in German minds, but even more so in the minds of our neighbors, the view has prevailed that the characteristic feature of every true revolution must be a bloody destruction of the former bearers of power and the ensuing destruction of public and private institutions and property. Mankind has become accustomed to regarding revolutions with these accompanying consequences as legal processes, which is to say, accustomed to facing the tumultuous destruction of life and property, if not with approval, at least with forgiveness, as the necessary accompaniments to revolution. This is the greatest difference between the National Socialist Revolution and other revolutions, perhaps aside from the fascist uprising in Italy. The National Socialist Revolution was almost completely bloodless. It did not cause any material damage at all during the time when the party took power, despite overcoming great resistance in Germany. I may say this with a certain pride. This was perhaps the first revolution in which not even one window pane was smashed. But I don't want to be misunderstood. If this revolution was bloodless, it was not because we were not men enough to see blood. For over 4 years I was a soldier in the bloodiest war of all time. I never once lost my nerve in any situation or under any pressure. The same is true of my comrades. We saw the task of the National Socialist Revolution not as destroying human lives or property, but rather in building a new and better life. It is our greatest pride to have carried out what is certainly the greatest transformation in our people with a minimum of sacrifice and loss. Only where the Bolshevik bloodlust tried, even after January 30th, 1933, to prevent the victory or the realization of the National Socialist idea by force, did we also respond with force and with lightning speed. Other elements, whose lack of restraint we recognized as being due to their political ignorance, we only took into safe custody in order to give them back their freedom after a short time. There were only a few whose political activity was merely a cover for their criminal inclinations, as evidenced by numerous prison sentences, whom we later prevented from continuing their pernicious work of destruction by putting them, probably for the first time in their lives, into productive employment. Has there ever been a revolution of such sweeping proportions as the National Socialist one, which nevertheless allowed innumerable former political functionaries to go about their work unmolested and in peace, and even awarded to numerous former bitter enemies the highest state offices and the full enjoyment of the pensions and annuities to which they were entitled? When we managed to form a government
Volkes, gib du jetzt deine Stimme ab. Wenn ja, dann tritt für mich ein, so wie ich für dich eingetreten bin. My dear fellow Germans, a sudden commotion has come over the German people. Now even those circles are beginning to stir, which until now have been deaf to the constant warnings that we have been trying to address to the mass of our people almost without interruption for the past 3 years. Of course, many people still do not know why they are upset. They believe that perhaps it is only about so-called special privileges, or about the restriction of freedom of speech, or about the politicization of the civil service, and so on. Certainly, all these are extremely serious matters. Today, however, it is about much more. It is about a huge process of destruction of our people and our fatherland. This is happening now before our very eyes. All these things would be trifles in themselves if they did not represent characteristics of a process which has been taking place for many years and whose end will be a horrible one. We can all sense that now two worlds are colliding with each other, and not only here, but everywhere we look, in the now oppressed Russia, in Italy, in France, and in England, etc. A relentless struggle between the ideals of the national-minded and the nebulous international. It is a struggle that now goes back almost 120 years. It began at the moment when the Jew received the right of citizenship in the European states. The political emancipation of the Jews was the beginning of a madness, for with it one gave full civic rights and equality to a people which was racially much more clearly and abruptly demarcated than all others, which always formed and will always form a state within the state. Perhaps not all at once, but it went just as it does today, and as it always has gone. First a little finger, then a second and a third, and so bit by bit, until at last a people which still in the 18th century appeared to be completely alien came to possess politically the same rights of citizenship as ourselves. And that's exactly how it went economically as well. The mass industrialization of the people meant the crowds came into being. Unfortunately, not properly handled by concentration of great large masses of workers in the cities. those who had the moral obligation to take care of them. In parallel with this, however, there was a gradual monetization of the entire labor force. The share system came into being, and as a result, the stock exchange gradually became the conductor of the entire national economy, but the owners of this institution were, and are without exception, Jews. I say without exception because the few more than who participate in it as non-Jews are in the end nothing more than token Christians who are needed to keep up the pretense to the broad masses that these institutions are natural to all peoples and their economies, while in reality they are institutions which correspond exclusively to the essence of the Jewish people and thus also spring from it. At that time, Europe stood at a crossroads. It began to divide into two halves, Western Europe on the one hand and Central and Eastern Europe on the other. Western Europe first advanced in industrialization, especially in England. Crowds of agricultural laborers, sons of farmers or ruined farmers themselves, poured into the cities and formed a new fourth estate. But there is one important fact here which many fail to take into account. England, like France, had relatively few Jews. The consequence of this, however, was that the great masses concentrated in the cities did not come into direct contact with this foreign nation, and the aversion which would necessarily arise did not find sufficient nourishment. Finally, the Jews of England, who at that time numbered scarcely 50 to 60,000, were able to Europeanize themselves with playful ease to such an extent that they remained hidden from the primitive eye of the common man, and he could not notice them as pillars of the economy, but especially as the bearers of great capital. They no longer appeared as foreigners, but as Englishmen themselves. This prevented anti-Semitism from gaining fundamental power in these countries. The same was true of France. Precisely because of this, however, it was possible to introduce in these countries the system known as democracy. Precisely in these countries, it was possible to establish a form of government that could mean nothing but the outweighing of intelligence and true energy by the sheer dead weight of the masses. In other words, it was possible there for the small class of Jewish intelligentsia hidden in the British people to manipulate the broad masses with playful ease in such a way that the latter, unaware of whom they were obeying, served the purposes of this small class. There, with press propaganda and control of information, it was possible to found the prototypical large parties. Even back then, there were always 2 or 3 groups that appeared to be fighting against each other, but in reality were all hanging on a gold thread, and everything was adjusted to a peculiar human characteristic. That man gets tired of something he has had for a long time. He wants something new. And so 2 parties were needed. One of them rules and the other one forms the opposition. When one party is played out, the opposition party comes to power, and the played out party now takes its turn as the opposition. After 20 years, the new party becomes played out, and the game repeats itself anew. In reality, this is certainly an ingenious mill in which the interests of a nation are ground down. As is well known, such a thing is called self-government of a people. In the process, we always find 2 main buzzwords, freedom and democracy, as figureheads. Freedom is understood to mean, at least among the authoritative bodies that actually govern, the possibility of plundering the broad masses without limits or resistance. The masses themselves, of course, believe that freedom means the exercise of a very particular freedom of movement, both freedom of movement of the tongue and freedom to move about the streets, etc. A bitter deception. On the whole, we can say that England, as well as France, put on the chains of slavery already back then. With a bronze firmness, these states are in Jewish chains as long as the Jew himself does not feel the necessity and expediency of a change in this condition. This change will also occur there in the foreseeable future. Now, what is the difference between this Western Europe on the one hand and Eastern and Central Europe on the other? Here, industrialization did not happen as quickly. The masses streamed more slowly from the static countryside into the cities. Only slowly did the large cities develop here, and it took a long time for a fourth estate to form in Germany as well. In addition to this, there was the fact that both in the East and in Germany, the presence of the Jew was constantly felt by the broad masses because of his greater numbers, so that the whole people had an inner instinctive aversion to him among all classes, but most of all the peasant, the worker, and the honest petty bourgeois. On the other hand, a part of our own aristocracy and a certain circle of merchants to whom money and gold are everything were the most quickly corrupted. If political contamination was already more difficult because of the large number of Jews and the consequent aversion of the mass of our people, the difficulty was increased by a form of government which did not place ultimate authority in the hands of a weak-willed and irresponsible so-called majority, but which was traditionally anchored in a personal apex, the monarchy. At that time, the Jew had to admit to himself that in these countries, the resurrection of an enlightened despotism would by no means be impossible. There were three powerful factors at the disposal of the head of state: the army, with a huge, wonderfully well-coordinated officer corps; the body of civil servants, with its enormous apparatus of completely dutiful officials; and a great broad mass of people who were inwardly still free from any poison. And if we add to this the fact that at that time the national intelligentsia in Germany was still almost exclusively predominant, that even wholesale trade was still in German hands, that above all the young, flourishing, rich industry was of German origin and German ownership, and that further the enormous peasantry, the last reservoir of a nation's strength, was still completely uncontaminated and healthy, we understand the following consideration of the Jewish people, who at that time were gaining political equality. When, through industrialization, a new fourth estate is formed in the cities, there is a danger that this fourth estate will fraternize with the monarchy, and that on this basis a people's kingdom or people's empire will come about, willing and ready to deal the death blow to the international financial powers. Therein lay a grave danger for Jewry. If the broad mass of the then forming labor force had come into national hands and had then seized the nation as a true social catalyst, if the liberation of the individual estates had taken place organically step by step, and if the state form had later been based on this, then what many hoped for on November 9th, 1918 would have come about: a national social state. For socialism as such is anything but an international creation. As a noble conception, it has grown exclusively in Aryan hearts and reaches its intellectual apotheosis only in Aryan minds. It is complete